Great. I'm just waiting for my screen to come up as being shared. If you just bear with me a second, I'm going to be talking about some of the areas in which these issues may come home to roost, and in relation to, in particular, to the contractual side. So, yeah, trust you can see my screen now, okay?
Yes.
So. So the first thing is just to mention that I mean, Bruno just touched on this, that the contract structure is different for floating than it is for fixed. Yes, in terms of the turbine generator, the provider of the substation and the cables, we see the same three parties in there. But for example, the vessel provider will not be installing as they are for fixed, but they will actually be towing and carrying out anchoring of the floating structure. There aren't any foundations, so we won't need any of those, but the floating platform provider, again, as Bruno has emphasized, plays a key part in this because the performance of foundations, of fixed foundations, is a lot more predictable as we are today than is the case for a floating structure. But just to think about this and think about, some of these differences and where there are learnings. So the technology status, while that's well and truly established, we've been building fairly large scale projects, certainly in the UK for 20 years now. But floating is relatively new technology. We'll talk specifically in a minute about where things are, but it's still at the new stage. The technology choices for fixed are largely settled on monopiles driven into the ground, obviously with the occasional use of jackets in certain conditions. But with floating, there are several different technologies which are fighting it out, so to speak, to see which one can become predominant, and maybe none. In relation to harbour requirement, fixed needs significant space in terms of harbour access, but with floating, it's also important that the floating structure can be built around either existing or specific infrastructure that's needed to be built to enable the construction of a floating offshore wind turbine unit. In terms of cables, well, cables, yeah, I mean, it should be an established technology, but it is certainly a regular cause of claims. If you talk to the insurance industry, it's the one part of a fixed floating wind farm that they would rather it didn't have. Obviously, that's not a viable choice. In the case of floating turbines, then the cables potentially may be connected and reconnected during the life of the structure. So the environment is even more challenging than it is for fixed. And the crucial bit, again, as Bruno emphasized, is that we have a limited number of sites only for fixed offshore wind. And in some countries, there are no suitable sites or virtually none. Whereas floating offers good sites in obviously, well out to sea with good uninterrupted wind, which is generally consistent, and there's many more of them. So we owe it to floating to ensure that it succeeds. And just to finish off, so where are there some areas where disputes might occur? So first of all, there's the question of harbour infrastructure. This is something that is put in, can facilitate the development of projects. I'd just like to put a plug in here, and the details of these will be provided after the webinar, as will the slides and the video. There's a book called How Big Things Get Done by Bent Flyberg, published last year by Macmillan. And he is actually very positive about offshore wind in general, because one of the basis of a good project is one that consists of a series of units that you can produce. You can industrialize the development. But the other point he makes is that you should think slow, i.e., develop the project slowly and then act fast. So I would suggest that in relation to harbour infrastructure, we should be thinking slow about what is it that we expect harbours to do, and then we can act fast in terms of getting projects built. Interface between the major contractors, again, Bruno touched on that. The solution, one would suggest, is first of all, good contracts in the first place, a strong focus on program management, and dispute boards. Very effective way of helping people find the right solution in a set of circumstances which may be out of all of the parties' control. New technology, well, the solution there, unfortunately, this has been adopted by many countries, is to go for demonstration projects. This worked really well in the development of fixed offshore wind, and we can see the beginning of this with floating in that a number of countries have made a specific effort to encourage those projects and help them to come forward, and then work their way down the cost ladder. And then finally, cables. Well, always a tricky one. You know, perhaps this is an opportunity to rebalance the balance between quality in terms of what we're expecting the supplier and the installer to do versus initial price. There's been a lot of temptation to take low initial prices, and that may be one of the causes of why cables, which is a relatively straightforward technology, is becoming one of the challenging areas. So those are some of my initial thoughts, and I look forward to discussing those further later on, and I'll pass over to Henrik to give his views.
Thank you very much, Nicholas, and thank you for having me participating here. My name then Henrik Borszewski. I am been now working with this industry for quite some time. And it's always interesting when you take these perspectives of how 10 years in an industry compares to other industries and experience from that. And I think as Bruno touched upon, you had the evolution of oil and gas going from onshore to near shore, offshore, and then deeper waters, and then floating units with mooring systems.
Apologies, Henrik. We cannot hear you very well. Could you please adjust your microphone a little bit?
Yeah, sorry about that.
Thank you.
Is that better?
A little bit, yes.
Okay. So the comparing this industry with what evolution we have seen, for example, in the oil and gas industry. We're migrating from onshore to offshore and deeper waters and floating systems. We benefit, I think, in our mitigating risk in the fact that we do have decades of experience from mooring systems, where even though we are mooring different units, there's no question that one of the reasons that floaters in offshore wind have been performing well over the last 15 years. I think the first floater was in Norway with Hywind and 2009. So it's actually 15 years ago that the first demonstrator went into the water and is still in operation. And I think whether it's a semi or a spar or a barge, they all have mooring systems that work. And that has been a tremendous benefit for floating wind to have had that experience from other industries such as oil and gas and shipping, to have that mooring knowledge implemented into our own designs going forward. So that's how we, as a risk mitigator, can actually look broader than our own settings to find solutions. But there's one risk that I'd like to raise, which might in some book be the highest risk, the binary risk, when you are investing your first million into a new market. And I call that binary because if you choose the wrong market, you lose that million. So it's not a matter of if your IRR is X or Y%, it's a matter of recouping your investment or not getting anything back. So that is the highest risk actually in my book, and that's what we have spent a lot of time within Hexicon Group to try to figure out which market to enter into and which introduction strategy to use. And here I'd like to point to a few factors that I think could be helpful to understand. And one of them, and this is of course our experience, so I'm not saying that this is a rule of thumb for the whole industry or the whole world, but I think it's an interesting reflection, and that is that entering into an energy market, it is always a regulated market. Energy is regulated by governance set out by local legislation, which is different from market to market. And when we set out entering our first foreign market, and we're based in Stockholm, Sweden, we have very little offshore wind, if any. So we could not rely on a home market. We have set up a structure by which in each market we select a partner, a local partner with a different set of skill set than our own, complementing into a joint venture, mostly 50-50, and a joint venture where the local regulatory skills and stakeholder management is managed by the local partner, and we have a generic skill set, which is the technology engineering. And you could wonder then, why would this local partner talk to a startup in Sweden? Well, one of the reasons is that we have our own technology for floaters that we have patented. That technology we offer as an exclusive right to the local joint venture that we set up. So we license our technology to this joint venture where we have 50%, and the partner who invests with us, if this partnership succeeds, they will have the exclusive right to market this technology when the market is mature. Now, this could happen in 3 years or 30 years. We don't know how far out. Floating wind will be a mature market with hundreds of turbines spinning 24/7. But we all know, I think, not only here on the panel, but also all listeners, that it will happen. And when we have selected markets, we've tried to look at markets where there is already a regulation in place that addresses the need for deeper water operations. And I can give us an example in Korea. When we went there in 2018, they already had their first legislation where they offered an incentive in the feed-in tariff the further offshore you are and the deeper water there is. Because they had already 10 years of experience of the conflicts between local stakeholders, such as fishery and marine navy or marine shipping lanes, on how it's so crowded, the stakeholders near shore. So they pushed it out to incentivize the industry to go further offshore. And that means it, as far as I know, it's the only market in the world that actually has that formula where you incentivize with a somewhat higher feed-in tariff the further offshore you are. And I would recommend other countries who would like to have deeper water focus to look at the Korean development. And they've actually just updated the regulatory base here in August. And I'll be happy to answer questions about Korea. I think it's a market we got started there, and it helped us to get started as a company as well. even though it's the other side of the world. But it was a refreshing experience, and we have also gotten return on our first million. So the investment paid off to actually get started there. Looking to Europe, I think that you have seen the demonstrators both in the UK waters, in French waters, and in Norwegian waters, and in Portugal, have meant tremendous benefit for all of us in the industry to prove that floating turbines in operation can weather whatever storms come about. And I think it also has given industry participants such as the turbine manufacturers, the EPC contractors, and the banks and the insurance companies an appetite for this industry to grow. So now it's a matter of what Bruno touched upon, is the commercialization, how you do these in large scale. And there, I think the gap between doing one unit with a 2-3 megawatt turbine and whether you do 75 turbines or 15 megawatt, it's a very large gap. So this will be done, I think, not as a straight line, but it will be heaps of development. And we will see now, I think, in the next auction in Korea, the first floating wind tracts that will be offering in the Korean auction coming up. There will be sites which are closer to 1 gigawatt than 500 megawatt, which will be the largest offshore wind auctions in deep water ever. So follow the Korean auctions coming up this winter. It's a recommendation from myself to anyone who would like to play in this industry. What also I'd like to touch upon is, here in Europe, how we go into these larger scale. And as we heard about ScotWind being a big allocation of large scale water, there's years out before these will be put in operation. We did see, however, I think a great development in France that had a 250 megawatt auction this year. And now recently with the AR6 auction in the UK, the winner was a over 500 megawatt wind farm project where 400 megawatt was put into the CFD auction and won, which means that it goes rapidly into the larger scale developments, which is very positive. This will be putting also the effort into understanding that with these bigger numbers, it becomes industrially of interest, because big companies don't want to work with demonstrators for too long. I think big companies really want to deploy capital and do it professionally and de-risked. And let's face it, this is infrastructure development we're talking about, and infrastructure is fairly conservative usually, and the finance cost is one of the highest cost elements. The fact that offshore wind on bottom fixed could decrease its cost was not only about turbines getting larger, it was also that the funding cost of the wind farm came down. So there are many learnings also from the bottom fixed industry. And here also, I think floating wind is benefiting from piggybacking. When I joined this industry, we thought that 5 megawatt turbines were very big. And 10 years later, we're talking about, will 15 megawatts turbine be around for a short term or a long term? And it just shows you we are now designing wind farms where 15 megawatt turbines is maybe the smaller ones for the next 5 or 10 years. And this has been, the cost of that development has very much been borne by the bottom fixed industry. It's the same standard turbines that we use on floaters. And the integration between the turbine and the floater, that is the key. This is a system that we are developing, and a system becoming a wind farm And there's one added element which is different that I also like to highlight, and that's the fact that what Nicholas touched upon, the cable and the many cases, and here is the dispute board, of course, very much aware that there is a new element of cable within floating wind, and that is the dynamic cable, the cable from the floater to the sea bottom. And that novelty is deployed then in 50 or 75 floaters connecting to the sea bottom. That is an element I think one should focus specifically on when you commercialize floating wind, is to make sure that we don't get stuck for too many years in figuring out not the technology, it's already in place, but how that element is, the costings of it and the insurance cost of it and the maintenance of it. So these are just a few highlights of what I think is key. I can mention finally also that from Hexicon's point of view, we have focused on a new market in Europe, which has only deep water, which is Italy. And we are happy to see that the government this year now is coming along with its regulatory framework for floating wind in Italy. But they don't have any floating wind installed as of today. But there are projects getting very far ahead for the first auction expected over the next 12 months. And finally, when it comes to our own technology, it is still to be provided in a full-scale environment. We are working closely with turbine manufacturers to make sure it is deployable. And it is still a technology that we are happy to license in our business model to a new country in the same manner as we have done in Italy and in Korea. And actually, we have also a setup in South Africa. So even emerging countries are coming up in our screen of how the world map will develop. So I think I'll stop there and be happy to take questions as we come along.
Thank you, Henrik. So you were mentioning Korea to be the most advanced, and then with Italy and South Africa coming to a close second. Are there any other countries that you think they could become leaders in floating offshore installations?
Well, I'm based in Stockholm, Sweden, and I would be utterly disappointed if we're not able to have a home market. And why do but that might be wishful thinking, a lot of people will say, because we don't have a separate tariff for deeper waters, but we have a very strong commercial PPA market, and we have a power deficit. And if you let me give another minute on this question,
yes,
Sweden
please.
is like Korea, more or less like a peninsula. Or Florida.
Sure.
It's a very long, narrow market. And the Swedish government has, over the last 15 years, closed down 6 of 9 nuclear plants in the south of Sweden without replacing with new large-scale power production. And the power deficit in southern Sweden has to be fulfilled by bottom fixed and floating, and maybe some new nuclear power. But this is the reason I think Sweden will be a very strong market, but it won't be driven by grants or by subsidies. It will be commercial PPAs and potentially a CFD, which is being investigated by the government as we speak.
Henrik. Bruno?
Yes, this question is a question many people ask me on pretty much daily. That and which are the floating wind technologies that will emerge in the future. In terms of, I do globally agree with what Henrik is saying in terms of countries that have a potential. I mean, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, France, Scotland, the US, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Greece. there are plenty, Australia, there are plenty of markets where floating wind is a key issue. To see where it will really emerge commercially first is very hard to say, because you need a certain alignment of planets. Yes, of course, you need energy deficit or an energy issue, like in Japan, was very much dependent from imported gas. But you also need to have a proper regulatory regime and regulatory framework. You need to have a political desire to, and politicians at the head of the state that are very motivated in terms of increasing their renewable energy assets, and have ambitious renewables targets by 2030, 40, and 50. You also need, ideally, a supply chain, because what's the point if everything has to be imported from the Far East, and impacting the carbon footprint, and et cetera, et cetera. So there's so many different countries. Where it will emerge first or in volume, to be honest, the more I know, the less I know. Because it is so politically driven. It's also driven by the existing grid network, and the maturity of that grid, or the capability of that local grid to welcome several gigawatts of new renewables. So the key is actually to be very actively observing all those key markets, looking at all those key elements, to ensure that the planets are aligned, and then hope that those states will set up the proper regulatory frameworks, the tenders, to make sure that the projects, or at least that investors, developers, are attracted to those markets. My answer is plenty of markets, and it's better to have a few eggs in many baskets than focusing on one market that from one day to the other can also turn around for very political reasons, for geopolitical reasons, etc. So yeah, but plenty of markets and plenty of opportunities.
Thank you, Bruno. There is a question in the Q&A. Is there higher risk with floaters of potential attack by states wishing to cut off energy to others in time of a conflict? Quite a difficult one, I would say. Who would like to go first, please?
I can, if you don't mind.
Yes, please.
Those large offshore wind assets are more and more recognized as critical power infrastructure. So that they're floating, fixed bottom, that they're near shore. I mean, every major infrastructure, energy infrastructure can become a target. Even without any physical attack, it can be an attack through some, through the internet or whatever. So, or through other ways, digital ways. So, but luckily, the governments have recognized that these assets are critical, and also making sure that things are in place to protect them, one way or the other. It is true that in Taiwan, given the current status with their neighbor, there might be a little more paranoia than in some other countries. But even in countries that are at peace, that don't have any issues with their neighbors, these issues are key, because energy is a critical infrastructure for a country. So measures are being taken, that's for sure.
Sure. Anyone would like to add anything?
Maybe just to say that I heard some time ago an interesting speech from one of the NATO bosses, who actually said that they, in their mind, offshore wind and floating wind is de-risking the energy supply compared to the other existing exposures with regard to military analysis.
One thing, though, it is true that, and we would not be very honest, we would be dishonest not to admit that some big players have exited some markets for geopolitical reasons. I mean, Taiwan is one example. I will not name names, but everyone knows who they are. But those are countries where their shareholders have preferred, for plenty of reasons, either because of their ongoing business with mainland China or because of the fear for a geopolitical crisis, not to invest in Taiwan, even though Taiwan needs that energy. So you do have those kind of issues, but in any case, they're considered assets, critical assets and strategic assets that will be the subject of the utmost protection and vigilance.
True.
Yeah,
Thank you. Yes,
just to add that I think that renewables offers an opportunity to significantly reset the way we think about energy systems. And I mean, for example, this is just to talk about solar for a minute, so I'm moving away from floating offshore wind, but that has created the opportunity in the same way as mobile phones have meant that sort of landlines just never happened in a number of countries. People have just switched straight to mobile. In the same way, diverse energy sources, be it floating offshore wind, far offshore, relatively near shore, fixed bottom, onshore wind, hydro, all of these different technologies create diversity. Whereas if you build very large nuclear plants, then you are making your system particularly unreliant because it has everything focused in one location. So geographic diversity is one of the big benefits that we get from renewables. And in order for that to happen, we need the right regulatory environment. Now, not every country has got this. There is a need for strong regulatory signals to encourage people to locate. And Bruno, I think it was, who mentioned earlier, or was it Henrik? Sorry, was talking about the concept of a much larger payment depending on how far offshore you were. The same thing needs to happen in relation to all technologies. So geographic diversity is one of the key benefits of renewables, but needs a little bit of support from the regulatory environment.
Thank you, Nick. And in a second question that adds to the fact that we looked at offshore as being strategic and regulatory needs. The questions, how should governments support offshore wind? Are there any ways to promote?
Well, I mean, obviously, I need to show a vested interest here. I'm a strong supporter of contracts for differences, already been mentioned by previous speakers. But the reason that contracts for differences are so important is that they do provide, let's say, a partial exposure to the market. So the constructor knows that he's going to get a certain price for his energy, but he also does see some market signals. And that is helpful in terms of making sure that plant is there when it's needed and it's not generating when it's not needed. Secondly, as the price of clean energy rises, which it inevitably will do, the subsidy falls at the same time. And we can already see this in the UK, where many of the fixed bottom offshore wind contracts will pay a substantial dividend to the UK consumer. And then finally, because you structure a CFD around an auction, then it encourages competition. So as I say, a really strong support for CFDs, maybe not for every country, maybe not for every stage of development, but generally, once you want to get into the industrial phase, CFDs are the answer.
Thank you, Nick. Bruno?
Yes, I do echo in terms of tender mechanisms or financing mechanism that CFDs are, at least at commercial scale, is the least worse or the better solution. But before that, when your question is what do government need to do and governments need to put in place, I think first and foremost is to make sure that all the key stakeholders within a country, from the politicians to the key industrial players to the grid operators, they're all rowing in the same direction. I see too many times in different countries, academia suggesting one thing, politicians and policy and one thing, policymakers another thing, industrial players another thing, each trying to access different funding, different grants, and not necessarily working in a unified thing. One of the strengths of Japan, and I know well for having been there for over 100 times and done and set up many partnerships there. Japan, yes, might be a slow mover, risk adverse by nature, but at the same time, they make sure that policymakers, Ministry of Trade and Industry, Economy, Trade and Industry, academia, grid operators, utilities, industry are all working in the same direction, which means that there's a concerted effort. We start seeing that in other countries, and I think that is key. There's nothing worse than having a country having great renewable energy ambitions and targets, either on their own or driven by EU agreements, but with all the different local players not working in a partnership fashion. And I have to applaud Scotland for that. The French government has, and France has been doing very well. Japan also, and that's why you see those three countries being also the first one, especially with innovative things such as floating wind, launching commercial scale tenders and setting up support mechanisms and making sure that the tender documents are complete, full, well written, anticipating all the issues. So I think the real first thing is that full alignment of all the key players and decision makers within both private and public, within a country, within a region.
Thank you, Bruno. Henrik, do you want to add?
Yes, thank you.
I think you're frozen. Can you?
Want to say actually that it's important. Hello?
Hello?
Can you hear me?
Could you please start over? Yes, now.
Okay, no, I was just going to emphasize and echo Nicholas and Bruno and just distinguish the CFD from any subsidies or grants, because it's actually a guarantee where you actually, as in the UK at some instances, the developer of the wind farm will actually pay to the government if the price of the merchant price is higher than the CFD price that you won the auction at. So it is not a guaranteed payout from the government, but it's a enabler of putting large-scale wind farms in place. I think the track record in the UK has proven this, and this has been studied by many. Much I hear it to be a subsidy, which it is not. It's actually not a subsidy at all. It could be something that is a very cheap way to get large-scale power into your marketplace.
Yeah.
Thank you. Whilst encouraging people to put their questions in the Q&A,
just whilst we're, as you say, Georgiana, it'd be great if anybody has any further questions, please to post them. But just to mention something else I think I see as being important, and I don't know what where Henrik and Bruno on this are, that you know, there is a strong benefit for offshore wind in general about the development of hubs. In other words, where government will decide that a particular location will be a good point from which offshore wind can be serviced and constructed. And in relation to floating offshore wind, I would see that particular facilities are needed. And I think that's an important part of, you know, what needs to be done in terms of governments on our behalf as society, showing, you know, what our commitment is to floating offshore wind by providing that infrastructure. But I don't know if Bruno or Henrik would like to add anything further to that.
I agree. I mean, it's exactly what this is all about, and I think the necessity for so many jurisdictions where there just isn't so many alternatives to jump over the bottom fixed 5 or 10 years right into floating wind will benefit the economy as well as being one of these. Is the timing is right, because the timing is now.
Yeah.
Now we've depicted a little bit the state of the land and the situation. Now I would be curious to perhaps hear a little more about how can arbitration and how can a dispute resolution board kind of help anticipate some of those key issues as we are entering into a commercial scale deployment phase. We're talking about bigger money. We're talking about players taking on bigger risks, design risks, execution risks, delivery risks, making huge commitments, etc. As I mentioned before, we are at a phase where you have key and usually very powerful players sitting at a table together, getting involved in something new, floating wind, in projects that have never been realized before, executed before, with technologies that have been perhaps proven by means of a full-scale demonstration project or pilot project, but never at bigger scale, with wind turbines that not yet exist. I would like to stress the notion of interface risk management. And that is why also at Wind Europe, one of the subcommittees I created recently was interface risk management, where it is important to highlight how can we anticipate issues and disputes by putting all the players around the table at the right time, making sure that contractually, pretty much everyone again is working as a partner and not eager to pull those contracts out of the drawer as soon as the project hits a snag. I think, especially in those first few projects that we'll see across the globe, commercial scale projects, constructive and intelligent collaboration amongst those stakeholders, who each are, of course, have a mandate to limit their risk, transfer the risk to the other guy, but also taking on some risk and sharing some of those risks. And by sharing risks, it means, yes, being willing to sit at the table, and instead of doing the blame game each time there is an issue, because a project that will take 10 years to develop and to be built will hit problems sooner or later. You cannot anticipate everything. So you need to have people that have that spirit of, let's find solution first and let's get blood on the wall afterwards, because usually those other things can happen. But let's even avoid that. So I would be very curious to see how dispute resolution boards being integrated early in the process
Exactly.
could actually avoid some of those growing pains, or at least alleviate those growing pains. Yeah.
Yes, from a dispute board point of view, I think early involvement is crucial, and perhaps even at the stage of the project preparation, when you do all the risk allocation metrics, when you're looking at the financial modeling projections, and everything. They need to be part of the whole process, so they could understand the difficulties that each parties are getting through, whether there is a regulatory problem, whether there is an environmental issues that might affect, whether there is something going on in the financial market. I think all these factors should be considered from very early on and involve a dispute board. Nick, you have much more experience in the field, so what's your take on this one?
Yeah, so I endorse what you've said. I think the crucial reason why dispute boards will make a difference in this industry is down to the point that Bruno made about the fact that, you know, you write a contract to deal with a set of circumstances that you know are going to happen. You need a dispute board to deal with a situation that you don't know is going to happen, which there will be a lot of in floating offshore wind. The dispute board can do several things. First of all, it can look at the commercial intention of the parties and say, right, we have a different situation here, and how we should deal with this situation that fits within the commercial anticipation of the contracts is X, Y, Z. And that is the role that a dispute board can make. It's a little bit of it like a mediation role, but it's presenting a solution that works to the parties, but also fits with what was originally intended in the contract. The second thing that dispute boards can do is that they can anticipate the problems. So we know it's very common in when these situations, when things go wrong, is they start to go wrong quite slowly, and it's at the beginning stage when you have an opportunity to come in with a relatively inexpensive solution. But at the time a project is beginning to become a problem, you know, nobody wants to deal with it because they're hoping that it will go away, and sometimes they do. But a dispute board can get in early and say, look, this is what we need to do. And, you know, certainly the projects and the disputes that I've worked on, really early intervention can be done at a relatively modest cost compared with what happens when things go wrong. And then the third thing a dispute board can do is when often a solution is visible to everybody and everybody knows it, but nobody's going to want to own up to it because it's going to cost them, let's say, a small amount of money. And therefore the dispute board is able to say, right, look, come on, guys, we've got to deal with this. It's going to cost you this much, you that much, and you this much. And everybody can sign up to that because they've been told that they need to do it, and people will accept that. But to actually volunteer is hard. So I think there are several ways there that a dispute board can make a difference. Definitely, they've got to come in early.
Yes, so definitely, just to help save face, especially local customs are very important, and I think a dispute board could help implement those customs and help the partners talk, communicate, bring them back to the table, and admit an issue without losing face, and help them go a step forward. Yes, sorry, you wanted to say something.
No, something actually. What was interesting in what just said Nick is we are in an industry where you start to you have the known knowns. You have increasingly, especially for a handful of players that have been in this from a technical or development point of view, that are familiar with the known unknowns. But
Sure.
here we are dealing with quite a bunch of unknowns.
And that's
And that is where it takes a few big men and women to sit around the table and be willing to accept that in a project there will be unknowns and unknowns, and that again, before starting to shoot at each other and opening up those claims books and or pulling out the contracts out of the drawer, that solutions need to be identified together.
exactly.
Without without putting the project at risk, because ultimately that's it is. What do we need to do to make sure that the project that was initially and wherever everyone celebrated around a few bottles when that contract was signed, how will that project still be delivered on time and on budget, achieving the IRR that is targeted by all the investors that have put their money at risk here? And again, we're dealing with the unknowns, and that deserves, and I think it's the only responsible way to find ways to mitigate those and to accept their existence and to find ways of how to address them in a timely fashion, because borrowing problems under the carpet is not a good thing either. You know? But sorry, I get a little excited by those things, because as both floating wind technology specialist, but also co-developer and advising infra funds and developers, I see those things, and each time it is my duty, I feel my duty to wake people up and say, guys, this is not La La Land. You know, we are going to your company, your project is going to hit issues. So how are you going to anticipate them?
And I think it's important from a financial point of view that the investors do not get scared away and run. They need to be told what's happening and that they could help the project just by being there, without reacting on a fear basis or the unknown that suddenly appeared, and take the wrong decision and destroy a project. I think that's important as well. Thank you. Oh, I've seen that Nick responded to a question in the Q&A. Okay. Well, if we have no other questions, any more? No one is brave enough? Okay, then I would like to thank you all for coming here together, and I would like to thank Bruno, Henrik, and Nicholas for sharing with us their knowledge and their passion about floating offshore wind. And I would like to invite you to join us again on 14th of November to our webinar on disputes boards on offshore wind multi-contract projects. Thank you very much, and see you next time.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.